welcome to this special episode of the Zoology Podcast. If you haven't listened to the episode on rewilding, please take a listen, because in this episode, we're going to be dealing with why rewilding can be so controversial. Putting it short, this episode will mostly be an off-the-cuff account of my issues with rewilding. Okay, with that said, please enjoy the episode. Now I want to start by saying I overall greatly agree with most of what rewilding aims to do. Or should I say, I agree with the description of rewilding stated in my previous podcast. That description read as, rewilding is a loose concept which features both large-scale and small-scale conservation efforts with a particular focus on reducing human management over long time periods, while simultaneously minimizing environmental risks through strengthening ecological systems, while also protecting and providing ecological corridors between protected sites to provide a better habitat for keystone species and predators. Okay, now that's a mouthful, but it all sounds good. But this definition is one I provided by looking at multiple sources and synthesizing their common key elements into one. And this is where my first issue begins. It's a loosely defined concept, which is given more and more attention without people actually knowing what they're talking about, or just forcing their issues into rewilding. So let's take a look at some definitions of rewilding I found and see what we make of them. The first definition is by Rewilding Europe. Their definition goes as the following. Rewilding is the progressive approach to conservation. It is about letting nature take care of itself, enabling natural processes to shape land and sea, repair damaged ecosystems, and restore degraded landscapes. Through rewilding, wildlife's natural rhythms create wider, more biodiverse habitats. So, okay, let's begin with the issues with this one. Jesus, right. So, the first issue is progressive. What do they even mean by progressive? Okay, do they mean in a political sense, as in leftist progressivism? Because if so, that's a really big issue, because not only are you therefore making conservation a massive left-right political issue, that in itself will divide people. So you're going to get people who are more, say, right conservative focused then being put off this aspect of conservation, because it no longer aligns with them politically, even though people on the right, obviously you can make a massive conservation effort by saying it's conserving heritage and that like. So already you're dividing people on an issue you do not need to be dividing them. If they don't mean that in a progressive in a political sense, then what do they mean it by? Do they mean progressively developing? If so, they should say that and not just leave it as a blank, it could mean anything up in the air type of state. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So my next issue is where they say, let nature take care of itself. Now this sounds good. Overall, it does sound like a very good goal, but it doesn't actually describe the process to get to the point at all. It's all willy-nilly. What are they doing to get to that point? You know, what aspects are they taking? You know, it's all fine and well to say this is what we want in the end, but you can't really just shove an endpoint into a whole concept and say that's it. Okay, great. You need to be more specific than that. Degraded environments, they can't take care of themselves, because if an environment's on a downward trajectory, then just by leaving them alone, all you're going to allow them is get more and more devastated until the habitats are basically, wasteland, not useful for any type of animal or wildlife, not useful for much biodiversity at all. It's super open-ended. So if this is going to take place, if nature is going to take care of itself, are humans involved at all in this process? Who knows? It's not very accurate. Okay, so now they also say, create more biodiverse habitats. How? They never say how, they don't state. Does this mean species reintroduction? Does this mean only native species, or maybe non-native species? Who knows? Super non-specific. Because this potentially could conflict with the goals of allowing nature to go through its natural rhythms as well. Natural rhythms sound boom and bust cycles. Sometimes biodiversity goes up, and then biodiversity goes down, and back and forth like a bunch of scales. But this then conflicts with their previous statement of saying, well, nature can take care of itself. So are they going to create these more biodiverse habitats without any human interaction at all? What if the original habitat is lacking a great deal of biodiversity? How is it going to come back? None of this is answered. Very annoying. Okay, let's move on to the next definition. This one is by the Rewilding Institute. This definition is the following. Rewilding is a comprehensive, often large-scale, conservation effort focused on restoring sustainable biodiversity and ecosystem health by protecting core wild/wilderness areas, providing connectivity between such areas, and protecting or reintroducing apex predators and highly interactive species known as keystone species. Okay, this is a better definition, I think, especially the bits about connecting areas and what they want to do with species. Very good, much better than the previous one, but it still has some issues. Key issue here is the reintroduction of predators. Predators are often needed to maintain a functioning ecosystem. This is very true. You'll get, for instance, if wolves have been driven extinct from an area, and deer, if they are present, are therefore generally unbounded by the amount they can reproduce and the areas they can consume food in. This means you're going to get deer in a lot of places where they wouldn't have been able to forage before due to their fear of being hunted. So places like river edges. When wolves are present, deer don't tend to forage near river edges because obviously the rivers create a trap for the deer, therefore making them an easy meal for the wolves. So when these wolves aren't present, they can obviously forage there. By them foraging there, what they then do is they tend to eat all the young saplings that grow up that create a stable bed at the sides of the river. So with these saplings now gone, it speeds up the erosion that the river causes by its natural process of flowing. And therefore you end up getting more flooding and more habitat destruction because of this. The actual river itself is less structurally stable. So reintroducing these predators obviously would be good for these type of habitats. But here's what we come to some issues, and I'd like to focus specifically on my own home country in Britain, specifically England. So wolves have been extinct in England for over 500 years. And other predators like bears, they've been extinct in England for over 1,500 years. This, coupled with intense human development of the countryside, has basically made England like the Shire. You know, there's a reason when something bad is happening in England, people say, lay back and think of England. They don't mean think of the cities. They don't mean think of the glorious English Channel, no. They mean think of the English countryside, the lovely Shire-like English countryside, the safe, protected, you can go out and stroll and you don't have to have a worry in the world English countryside. By reintroducing predators to a place like England, what you're doing is you're tearing down the heritage of all Englishmen. I really want to make this statement clear. That is a terrible thing to do. You can't strip an entire people of their heritage just because you want to reintroduce some wildlife, especially if you haven't had massive consultation with said people. Let alone the actual practical issue of reintroducing wildlife like wolves into England. Okay? Wolves are a predator species. You will get eventual human death, let alone the death that is going to be caused from the predation of farmers' livestock. Now, sure, you could counteract this by just have a compensation scheme in place for any livestock the wolves take, like they do in places like Nepal with snow leopard predation. And that's very true, you could. But persecution of these predators was the key reason these predators went extinct, was due to negative perception of them and bounties. Now, if you reintroduce these predators back into England, and these predators interrupt the peaceful, Shire-like quality of the English countryside, they will be viewed as negative by the English people. This will not be good for future conservation efforts, and for the wolves that have been released themselves. This could eventually lead to the persecution of these wolves, and they're driven to extinction again. Maybe what instead we should do is, instead of focusing on predator species that may kill, you could either one, handle it like we handle already and do things like deer culling. So up in Scotland, they have an annual deer hunting season. So you can pay hunters to hunt the deer there in more ecological valuable areas such as riversides. And deer are smart animals. They will quickly learn where they're going to get shot and where they're not. They want to live. If that's not the thing, maybe you reintroduce some smaller predators, say something that we haven't had in the last few thousand years. But maybe you could try to convince the English people that maybe something like the Eurasian lynx would be a good release. Lynx aren't going to attack people. I don't know of any accounts of lynx ever attacking and killing a person. So maybe this is something you could do. But again, you need good consultation with the people whose the natural landscape you're changing because it is their natural heritage. This landscape is theirs and they need to be consulted. Okay, let's move on to the next rewilding definition. This definition is provided by Rewilding Britain and goes as follows. Rewilding is a large-scale restoration of ecosystems to the point where nature is allowed to take care of itself. Rewilding seeks to reinstate natural processes and, where appropriate, missing species, allowing them to shape the landscape and the habitats within. It is focused firmly on the future, although it does learn from the past. So, this is quite good. I like its future-looking direction with its fulfillment from the past. Very good. The past will always act as a foundation for the things you can build off in the future. So it's good that they can acknowledge this. But what is the issues I have? Well, one of the issues is nature is allowed to take care of itself. Okay, humans are part of the natural ecosystem. So you can't really take humans out of it, especially not in an island nation like Britain, where we're incredibly densely packed. I think the key thing is to identify which human behaviors are really detrimental to these ecosystems and then try to change them. That would make much more sense than just saying humans cannot be involved. Humans are an animal. We are a natural part of the ecosystem. We just have to be responsible. Okay, the next bit is reintroducing missing species where appropriate. Okay, this is fine. Where appropriate. I like that key figure. That's very nice. Very good. Appropriateness is very good. But reintroducing missing species, how are they going to conclude what species is missing? Is this done from what species were present in the past? If so, then how far in the back of the past do you actually look? Or is it a missing species based on its ecological role? So for instance, will they be thinking of reintroducing predators, where predators such as, say, black bears never existed in the past? It's something to consider, because I think this bit is very open-ended and would allow for people to reintroduce things that are non-native to an island like Britain. And as we know, reintroducing non-native species doesn't tend to go very well, because humans tend not to be able to understand the consequence of non-native species introduction. So I think I can state it as this. My overall issue is with the lack of a firm universal definition of what rewilding is. So I've had a bit of a think about this, and I'm going to provide one that I think covers most of the bases. So I think it should go as this. Rewilding is the process of conserving ecosystems and their native species through habitat protection, connection, and restoration, which aims to restore a specific area to a wild state in which it existed in the recent past and or before extreme human impact, which then has the end goal of human beings having minimal influence in the area once it has been restored. I believe this definition provides a clear understanding to what actions are allowed in a specific area and what is the end goal of said action. I specifically stated that rewilding aims to conserve native species and to restore an area similar to a time it was in the past. Now this area of time is adaptable because it's a recent past. You can argue what a recent past is. I would say it's maybe a few hundred years, maybe up to 500, something like that, a bit of a limit. Or before the time in which humans had a major impact. So therefore you've got a bit of flexibility, because humans may in certain areas only have had a major impact in the last few hundred years. It may have been for thousands of years. So it depends, but I think these go in tandem with each other. So if humans have had a major impact starting 1,000 years ago, the goal should be only a recent rewinding of the clock. So sure, humans may have had a massive impact, but this does make them part of the natural ecosystem. Therefore, if you just try to rewind it a few hundred years, that's better than doing nothing, especially for the native wild species. I think my definition here stops people in the name of rewilding, and this is key, introducing non-native species and trying to recreate habitats from a time period in the very distant past. So obviously you're not going to reintroduce dinosaurs or anything to Britain. Sure, we have the Jurassic Coast, but you're not going to see a Stegosaurus walking on it anytime soon. Now, both these issues of non-native species introduction and not having a clear timescale definition of what you're trying to restore seems to be prevalent throughout all the other definitions. And I think this is really concerning, especially when you consider that rewilding is being advocated for by influential institutions like the United Nations or IUCN. So I'll give you an example, one that quite annoys me. For instance, in Britain, non-native species like the European bison are being set to be introduced into Kent in 2022. So now this is being done in the name of the ecological services that the bison will create for the landscape in which it is released. But European bison have never been native to Britain at all. They're introducing a completely foreign species into a place that has never seen it. We've done this before, it always leads to catastrophe. The European bison has evolved to live in the European plain. Kent is not the European plain, it's not a flat grassland. Kent is quite hilly. Sure, it has grassland areas and plateaus, sure, but it's a very hilly place, and it's incredibly densely populated by people. Even if you go to the Kent Downs, which is a lovely green strip all the way through the centre of Kent, it's beautiful, don't get me wrong, it's really nice, but there's villages everywhere. Kent is not a place for a non-native species like the European bison, especially when you could be reintroducing it into its historical range. So I don't understand why they've done this. This is ridiculous. You can't just introduce a non-native species into a place it has never existed before and expect everything to be hunky-dory. If they wanted to have a similar ecological impact, why don't they just release some cows that are native to Britain? Why do they have to introduce a species that has never been there? It doesn't make any sense to me. And then, if you do reintroduce this species, the European bison, well, you're going to need to eventually control its population if it's successful, aren't you? So does that mean then you have to reintroduce predators? Because then you're going to ruin what I talked about earlier, and you're going to destroy the natural heritage of the English. Which, obviously, is a very cruel thing to do, you know? Now, I think the main thing here is that you can't introduce a foreign species without unintended consequences. Let me tell you a story. This is one we always get told at university, and I think it's quite attuned to what the issues are. Australia's sugar plantations had a massive issue with the sugarcane beetle destroying a lot of its crops. Now, the Australians thought it'd be a very smart idea to introduce the cane toad, thinking cane toads prey on cane beetles. Cane beetles are destroying the sugar crop. Therefore, if we introduce cane toads, they will eat the cane beetles, and this will protect the yield of sugarcane. Completely logical thought. Okay, here's where it all went wrong. The sugarcane beetle tends to exist at the top of the sugarcane plant. The cane toad exists at the bottom. Now, there are more species existing than just the cane beetle, and the cane toad has an incredible appetite. So what did it do? Would it go for the hard to reach and obtain sugarcane beetle that live at the top of the sugarcane? Or will it just eat every other animal that is close to the ground? Well, yeah, it ate every other animal that is close to the ground, and then it started reproducing like mad. The bad thing about the cane toad is that it's incredibly poisonous. Because it's not a native species to Australia, the native wildlife and ecosystem is not adapted to the existence of the cane toad being there. So, when you get animals that try to predate on it, like certain types of snakes or mammals, they end up dying from the poison because they don't have any natural adaptedness to deal with such poison. So they all die. And you have a massive die-off of species like quails, loads of different things that are now just restricted to a few islands off the north coast of Australia. All because the natural ecosystem is not prepared to deal with a species like this. What the Australians eventually did is they had to build an entire fence to try to restrict the spread of the cane toad from the northeastern part of Australia and into the west. And they're toads, it's really hard to get. People have to go out and shoot these things, and they still keep on spreading. Now, given enough time, Australia's wildlife should be able to adapt to them, but that's beside the point. They shouldn't be there in the first place. I think this lesson is something we clearly still haven't learned. If people are going to introduce non-native species into an area they've never existed before, you have to expect unintended consequences. To not understand this or acknowledge this shows incredible ignorance. Okay, anyway, that's a bit of a rant over. I just don't think it's a good idea, and I think people should think more deeply about the animals they introduce into ecosystems in which they've never been present. I think you can take this idea of introducing things that have not been present to an extreme degree, and I'd like to discuss something called Pliocene Rewilding. Now, Pliocene Rewilding is the idea of reintroducing of extant Pliocene megafauna, or their close ecological equivalents, into a specific area. This idea was proposed by a Brazilian ecologist, Mario Galetti, in 2004. He wanted to introduce elephants and other proxies of extinct megafauna to private lands in the Brazilian Cerrado and other parts of the Americas. That's crazy. The gall of some ecologists. Putting aside that the world and ecosystems we have today, they're not the same as those in the Pliocene area. I mean, that's a time that started 2.6 million years ago and ended around 12,000 years ago. The world has changed since then. But putting that aside, we have seen the simple devastation of what introducing non-native species can do, as with my previous example of the cane toad. Now, imagine the unintended impact with loads of other predators and herbivores all thrown in, all interacting in places like Europe, Brazil, and North America. There was an attempt started in 1988 that I know of by the geophysicist Sergei Zimov, who wanted to establish a Pliocene park in northeastern Siberia. Now, northeastern Siberia, you think, oh yes, quite isolated, is a good place to test out this type of hypothesis. Well, Zimov released Yucatan horses, reindeer, European bison, plains bison, domestic yak, moose, and Bactrian camels, and has a future plans to release Siberian tigers. Now clearly this experiment could tell us what this type of rewilding could achieve. But geez man, there are so many issues with just introducing foreign species into an area that I really don't know where to start. Let alone you're introducing European bison and plains bison. I don't even know what happens if species like that are going to breed and then are moved across the rest of the world. There's too many issues, let alone pathogen issues, let alone unintended ecological interactions. It's something like this really shows the folly of man. And I'm going to end it as that. Okay, overall I think we need to be far more grounded with our aims of rewilding. We need to acknowledge our lack of understanding about ecosystem interactions, especially when it concerns ecosystems that have been heavily affected by humans and the reintroduction of long-gone species. While we also need to adapt a universal rewilding framework that is specific and can achieve conservation goals while not being so extreme that it invites unintended ecosystem devastation.